Banking Book Webinar Series 2, Episode 3, Managing and Forecasting Cyber Risk, presented by BBA.
Welcome to our episode 3 of our second webinar series, Managing Forecasting Cyber Risk. We have Suhail Farouk as our speaker, and so is the CEO of BBA. He has held senior roles globally with companies such as Oliver Wyman, HSBC, and Moody's. We also have our senior advisor, Andy Papawa. He's a former regulator and past CEO of DICO. Andy currently serves as chair of the board and senior strategist advisor to a number of organizations, including regulatory agencies and private corporations. Let's do a few housekeeping items. So this meeting is being recorded. So by staying in, you opt to, accept the recording. Any questions, please just put them on the chat or send them directly to me. And we'll have the last few minutes of the webinar to respond to those questions. And also, as we're expanding our media presence, not only with webinars such as this, but also with basically a chat that we're calling Coffee Break with BBA, a journey to the C-suite, which is a 15-minute rapid-fire Q&A where we trace the career path of successful executives. It has two takeaways. One is giving back to the community, such as youth to emulate, follow the footsteps, and the other is knowledge transfer, such for peers to learn from the experience of other executives. And we're always looking for new guests. So if you have interest, I'll leave my email in the chat. Just get in touch or put your email in the chat and we'll get in touch with you as well. With that, I'll pass the baton to Suhail and Andy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. Hi, as Paula introduced, my name is Suhail Farouk. I'm the CEO and founder of BankingBook Analytics. Here at BankingBook Analytics, our mission is to develop decision support systems for financial services organizations. As you can see it on the slide in front of you. We use precision analytics, algorithm, machine learning, AI, and statistical and econometric coding to develop software, as well as we provide advisory. But before I get into a bit of a deep dive about what we do, I want to actually set out what our purpose for existence or for being is. Our purpose for being is to innovate, build trust, and give control back to our clients. As a software vendor, we believe that the clients come first. And using our capabilities in the financial services domains, such as risk, finance, operations, and treasury, we develop financial services applications that remove silos and enhance productivity, covering areas such as capital management, profitability, stress testing, and so forth. For more information on our products and services, please feel free to visit our website. In addition to the SaaS or software as service solutions, we also provide advisory to our financial services clients. We create value for retail, commercial banks, and credit unions by delivering information, analyses, and automated solutions to help improve revenue generation across pricing, product development, treasury, and risk management. Here's a brief overview of our applications that are currently being used by some of our credit union and mid-sized financial institutions / banking clients. I'm not going to deep dive into the entire sort of catalog of our applications, but one thing of note with regards to today's webinar is the Cyber 360 Degrees. This is the product that is created at the back of the framework that we're going to discuss today. And if you're able to understand the framework, you'll be able to actually better get yourself informed with regards to the product itself. With that, I'll pass it on to Andy, and then we will deep dive into today's presentation. We'll start with the warm-up and current analysis. There are some key takeaways with regards to the learning outcomes, such as how can we align cyber risk with enterprise-wide risk management. So to get to that stage, we need to understand what is happening in the current state with regards to the chief information security officers, chief information officers, what is the severity and frequency of cyber attacks, and how we can develop a robust framework that is going to actually allow us to manage, not just manage, but also prepare ourselves to forecast the cyber attacks. And then we would introduce the solution that I just referred at the beginning, and we'll talk briefly about the benefits and key takeaways. In the meantime, if you have any questions, or if you have any if you have any specific learning outcome that you would like us to focus on, please feel free to drop it off in the chat box. Paula would forward it to me, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you, and over to you, Andy.
Well, thank you, Sohail, and good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I guess it's still afternoon here in the eastern part of the country. So Sohail, as he's indicated, this is becoming an issue given the circumstances that we're living in today. The whole idea of digitization of our economy has moved forward very, very rapidly to take advantage and to protect the interests of various organizations, including financial services. So we've probably progressed in the last 9 months what would have normally taken a number of years. And of course, as these digitization efforts move forward quickly, there's the risks associated with those, and of course, cybersecurity being a major component of that. When you start developing new applications and new ways of doing business, including control systems, in a fairly significantly advanced stage in terms of speed of implementation, there are probably opportunities for bad actors in the cybersecurity space to take advantage of those. So one of the things that we are focusing on now as we go through this whole process is looking for ways to make sure that the investment that we have to make in cybersecurity makes sense from the perspective of the organization. So the question then starts becoming, how do you measure those costs and measure the benefits of those integrated systems? What comes first and what comes next is a big issue as well. And finally, while we're busy cutting other expenses, including people in some cases, because of the COVID situation, how do you make sure there are compensating controls in place around the things that are left to deal with? So, so he will explain in a minute. We've talked a little bit about how a forward-looking IT security and risk management program helps address some of those questions. And how do you measure that? And I think measurement of cyber risk is a very challenging, endeavor. Only because you just don't know what's on the other side of that fence until you get there. So one of the things that needs to get done is from a business perspective, and is building a business case to make investments on this whole issue of cybersecurity. And any chief risk officer of any organization, including financial services companies, will tell you it's a hard sell to go back to senior management and say, I need X number of dollars or people and resources to mitigate these risks, because you don't really know what those risks are. So a huge challenge facing all of us going forward, and now we need to think about how we get moving on in this direction. So I'll pass it back to you, Sohail, for a little bit of conversation around where we go from here.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Andy, for that elaborate introduction. And taking the cue from Andy's introduction, basically, purely from a mathematical perspective, if you were to actually try and model something that has to do with the cyber attack, you need to understand what is the attack surface, which is really vulnerable from the bad actor's perspective, and where do the vulnerabilities reside, and how we can actually enhance resilience. So in today's conversation, we are really going to talk a little bit about, as Andy alluded, that the attack surface continues to get bigger and bigger. Work from home as a result of COVID-19 has actually also created an additional layer of attack surface that needs to be protected. So potentially what we are looking at is a downside risk. And as the economy contracts the vulnerabilities starts re-emerging, the cyber attacks continue, they start proliferating. So there's a direct correlation with regards to the contraction in the economy and cyber attacks. I'm not going to get into the details with regards to the severity of the cyber attacks and the frequency of cyber attacks, because I do think that, one of the given for attending today's webinar is really you have been able to actually understand that cyber risk in its different manifestations has become a current and immediate focus and a reality from risk management perspective. So if we have, hypothetically speaking, if we have a chief information security officer who wants to get his budget enhanced to be able to improve the resilience of the organization, what kind of steps that are needed here from a CFO's perspective, from CEO's perspective, and how those steps can be actually organized and integrated within the enterprise risk management framework. So that's really the key question that we are going to address today. And doing so would also allow us to actually, as Andy mentioned, to develop a cost-benefit analysis and create a priorities framework. And in a nutshell, develop a return on investment from a project perspective. So yeah, those are some important questions that we need to answer in today's webinar. Right. So I think before we set the stage in terms of how we can get there, we need to understand what is the current state of CISO practice that exists. In a nutshell, Chief Information Security Officer's practice can be best construed as a firefight practice. It's essentially preparing the organization to be able to withstand and to kind of thwart any possible cyber attack from network, internal and external network applications, core systems, databases, and any other vulnerabilities with regards to the IT layers that exist. So technically, if we were to look at it, there are several technologies and enhancements which are available, and yet the organizations continue to face severe cyber attacks. So that firefight mode needs to be enhanced or perhaps changed from a reactionary mode to a proactive mode, i.e. a realignment from a what-if perspective. But we cannot really take a big step to get to the what-if perspective or a forward-looking or a forecast perspective in one giant leap. We need to be able to develop a control framework. So if you were to actually look at the slides that I'm presenting to you now, at the bottom of the pyramid, you will see that this framework is identified in terms of 3 different steps. So as I said earlier, the firefight mode, which I'm calling a yesterday mode, is really based on the maturity of the organization. So as an organization develops and grows, along with it, the IT systems, the security, information security, and security operations center, and those type of technological collaterals and assets, they start emerging. So that's sort of, if that part is completely taken care of, then of course, we consider ourselves that we are well safeguarded. Now, if that safeguard that we talked about is already in place, then what is the next step that we need to take? Now here, we need to align the CISO's role and their approach or practice with the enterprise risk management framework. So within that context, we are looking at integrating information security practice with an overall enterprise risk management framework, i.e. speaking the same language as the chief risk officer, as the board, as the chief information officer, and also most importantly, the chief executive officer. And once we have taken that step, then we need to start looking at what can we do in terms of enhancing our game and to be able to proactively defending the organization. Now, here are some of the KPIs that we want to look at are continuously keeping ourselves abreast of the best practice approaches, understanding the technology and where it is heading, and of course, keeping a track of the attack surface and how that attack surface can be safeguarded, i.e. vulnerabilities can be patched and resilience improved, and how the targets which are potentially going to become available to cyber attackers or the bad actors, how they can be actually reduced from a vulnerability perspective. So that's the tomorrow's approach. So indeed, we are looking at 3 different dimensions. First dimension being yesterday. Second, what are we doing today with regards to integration with the enterprise risk management? And third is really a forward-looking focus. So that's really the framework based on which we are going to outline the distribution analysis of information risk, the research that BBA completed together with Global Risk Institute. Right. So this brings us to the next learning outcome. Here we are talking about what steps need to be taken to align cyber risk practice with the enterprise-wide risk management framework. So the key question is, what are the sources of cyber risk? Now, using operational risk analogy, we can really group the sources of cyber attacks in 4 different areas or 4 different dimensions. The first and foremost is people. The second is the systems. And the third is process and external. Fourth is external. Now, under the people dimension, the research tells us that cyber attackers take advantage of unsuspecting employees and human behavior. Approximately 80% of all data breaches are a function of compromising human interface with technology. So in order for us to really allow our employee and the workforce to understand that what the cyber attacks can really do in order to harm the organization, we need to be able to provide them with some training. We need to be able to create some key risk indicators which would allow us to identify on an upfront basis that such assurances and targets which should be mitigated have already been addressed on an upfront basis. The second part is the systems. Now, if you were to look at the systems purely from an attacker's perspective, we can again group them in 4 different categories. The first is the network. Now, within the network, you can create internal and external networks. From external networks perspective, we can talk about the routing system. We can talk about the information highway that provides the input to the information which the organization uses. Then we can think about the systems such as core banking systems used for the payment processing and so forth. Then we are talking about the applications which are used very, very frequently within the organization, such as applications relating to risk measurement, risk management, credit risk disbursement, and so forth. Treasury, backend reconciliation, asset liability management, and those type of applications that we're referring to. And the fourth and foremost is really the data, which includes the data warehouse, also includes different types of data marts and so forth. So we can group the system in 4 or 5 different dimensions and then start mapping the people who are actually involved in those within the system and the process framework. And finally, we can also think about cyber attacks which can really be non-idiosyncratic and which can really be part of the systemic risk, such as attacks which are perpetrated by a rogue actor from overseas, such as examples are Crimea virus, which was initiated from Korea and so forth, North Korea, beg your pardon, or any other sort of type of external attacks. So by grouping them in 4 different categories, and what we are doing here is we are using the existing knowledge base within the organization, which has been pre-existed for quite some time from an operational perspective, and allowing ourselves really to develop analytical dimensions from an attack and sources of attack perspective. So that's the step number 1. Now, if you were to actually extrapolate that step and identify that what would be the mandate that CEO would actually assign to Chief Information Officer, which in turn would go to the CISO, is that CEO would like to actually have the organization perform smoothly and have no operational constraints. CEO would also like to avoid any reputational risk associated with data breaches. So, operations, data breaches, which would actually lead to the reputational risk, performance with regards to the regulatory compliance, i.e. avoiding any fines and so forth. So that's the sort of mandate that the CEO would give. And this can be really boiled down to one sentence in a risk appetite statement, which says that no significant operational constraints on growth, which are actually derived from the cyber risk. And then the mandate would actually be passed on to the chief information officer, and who can then say that, my KPI is that there will be no single security event which can cause a deviation of more than X% from revenue or profitability targets. It could also be mapped to the rating targets or any reputational risk or reputational loss, and then using that as the baseline mandate, the CISO can actually develop another mandate, which is really translated into or can be derived from the above statement, that how we can manage enterprise-wide vulnerabilities among people, process, and systems, both internally and externally, as well as for the third party. So that's the kind of landscape that we are dealing with here. And that's the sort of integration that we are talking about in terms of purely from a technological or technical perspective, all the way into the integrated with the enterprise risk management framework, and utilizing the same language, utilizing the same sort of framework to be able to actually safeguard the organization.
So
Any questions?
Yeah, Sohail, it's Andy here. How would you see the risk appetite statement for this area of risk differentiating, or maybe better still, aligning itself with the risk appetite statement for the entire organization?
Right, that's a wonderful question. So we've given some examples here, Andy, with regards to integrating or aligning the risk appetite statements with the key performance indicators of the organization. So let's just say, what is most important from an organizational perspective? Some organizations, they would like to actually have a headline risk appetite statement which states that our rating would not drop below BBB+, right? And that's a sort of, mission statement that allows these organizations, especially the financial services organizations, to perform, so that their cost of capital does not go up, right? So that headline statement can then be really transcribed, and different mandates can be derived for the C-suite using that sort of headline risk appetite statement. So that's one example of that. And as we've identified here, that from some organizations' perspective, such as, let's say, a brokerage platform, if a brokerage platform goes down, a lot of the trades would not be able to get booked, and this could result in clients leaving the brokerage platform and moving to another brokerage. Similarly, from a treasury perspective, if it's an active treasury that is really involved in equity trading, and they become vulnerable. So I think it all comes down to what is your core activity that really sort of identifies with your functionality, with your mandate, and with your license that you have. And you can then sort of create different versions of these risk appetite statements, which would allow the rest of the C-suite really to follow suit, as we've given an example here from a CIO perspective and from a CISO's perspective.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Perfect. So the next one is, going back to the framework that we just described, that, what was going on in a firefight mode and how a firefight mode can be changed into perhaps more of a present day mode, and then what could be the forward-looking framework that we can develop. So all of these three frameworks or these three dimensions, they work hand in hand, they work together. And this leads us to something which is really very basic that every organization is usually involved in. And that is really the risk identification and assessment, the analysis of the risk, and taking steps or developing an action plan to mitigate those risks. So really, when you look at the sort of the core mandate, which we're calling the yesterday's mandate, is predominantly internal based. It's really how do we react to an attack? The today's mandate is really looking into the data. What are the trends? How can these trends actually translate themselves into risks? How we can assess those risks and how we can group those risks, and what kind of concentration that we need to deal with to mitigate any event risk associated with cyber. So for all these things, we can look at what are the legal claims from a cyber perspective, which have been adjudicated by the courts, what have been the fines. A lot of research is out there which is telling us that cyber attacks may be very high frequency but low severity. On the flip side of it, we see that cyber attacks could be high severity and low frequency. As the cyber risk phenomenon is still sort of it's so complex and it has many layers to it that we aren't really able to define whether it's low severity and high frequency or high severity and low frequency. But we need to be able to actually create a framework that addresses these two dimensions holistically. And that framework can be really lead us into a forward-looking what-if scenario. So what-if scenarios are really the key to understanding and be able to synthesizing that where our organization's vulnerabilities exist and how we can enhance the resilience associated with those vulnerabilities. And this is really an exercise that cannot be done in isolation. We need to be able to actually use this, the what-if scenario type approach in a workshop setting, in a communal discussion, and risk control self-assessment type of frameworks, bringing in more and more people and developing a control failure framework, which would actually allow us to be able to understand that what happened in the past, again, similar events, did they take place in the past, and how they were dealt with in the past, but not just by our organization, but organizations outside of our spectrum. Thinking outside the box, we can also start thinking about what could be really a possible vulnerability that exists, can potentially be exploited by rogue actors, and which can lead to a successful cyber attack. And then, of course, could have devastating impact in several different dimensions on the organization. So really, if you were to actually harmonize this entire concept, what we are dealing with is a pre-existing enterprise risk management framework, and it's really nothing new. However, we are realigning the entire focus of cyber risk purely from a technology perspective to all the way to an enterprise risk management perspective. Right. So here we're going to talk a little bit about what solution has been developed by BankingBook Analytics. Before I actually get into the details of the solution, a little bit of background and acknowledgement of our partners. I'm sure Luis Tullo is on the call, Sergey is on the call. A paper that was developed last year by BankingBook Analytics together with Global Risk Institute, in which we came up with this framework, which is known as distribution analysis of information risk. Now, distribution analysis of information risk is a cyber quantification methodology which maps the cyber events with a hierarchical risk taxonomy, using those 4 dimensions that we talked about: people, process, systems, and external, and as the sources of cyber attacks. And then the key objective of developing this type of framework was to really for us to highlight where the highest dollar of threat may be coming from. And again, associated with that highest dollar of threat is also the project and the budget that we're talking about. In other words, what could be the highest return on investment, So on the other side of the equation. Similarly, from management and board's perspective, that how we can integrate cyber risk management with the risk appetite framework. And the third important takeaway from this framework is helping to make better informed decisions relating to expenditures, cyber risk mitigation, what kind of insurance that we need to hold, and internal capital requirements. So if there is no technology that is available for us to patch our idiosyncratic systems, what kind of internal technology that we need to be able to develop. And the final piece is the helping management demonstrate to regulators that, the organization is managing cyber risk in a comprehensive and robust way. So those were the 4 key takeaways that led us to developing distribution analysis of information risk. Right. So really, if you were to actually look at the continuum of cyber threats or cyber attacks, what we see is that we talked about trends. So these trends are essentially the threats, and which can materialize into risks. Risks can materialize into losses. So what we need to really do is we need to have an organization-wide unified risk taxonomy. And using that as a baseline, we can develop a what-if scenario-based model, which is going to be able to get us to the answers that I just asked. So historically speaking, we've seen that these cyber attacks have had very idiosyncratic names, such as, crimey, malware, malicious insiders, which could be really the data breach or data thieves. So we can talk about phishing and social engineering. So they can all sort of boil themselves down to these sort of potential vulnerabilities that we have here. And then they can be mapped to an organizational risk taxonomy. So if we were to actually look at these cyber threats, which are pre-existing, they can be mapped to an organization's risk register. This risk register would have key headlines such as potential loss of competitive advantage, which are impact-based. So replacement of an asset, fines and judgments, which can come against the organization. For example, in California, a single data breach can cost up to $5,000. And if there's a large pool of data that goes missing or that goes into the hands of the hackers, a huge sum of fine can be actually imposed on the organization, which can lead to several sort of knock-on effects, such as loss of reputation, and loss of productivity and so forth. So again, as we mentioned earlier, that what are the sources of these attacks? As we talk, that we have people, process, systems, and external events. So these are the sources of attacks. So the entire spectrum of risks associated with cyber can be mapped to internal risk taxonomy, can also then be segregated into different dimensions of sources of attack, which can then be broken down into 3 different hierarchical risk classifications. And these 3 different risk classifications are operational cyber risk, business cyber risk, so which essentially is really the knock-on effect of a direct cyber attack in terms of the reputational risk, downtime of an asset, which can lead to increase in the cost or loss of productivity. And then, of course, we talked about the systemic cyber risk, which is really potentially, knocking down the entire stock exchange of a country, or knocking down the infrastructure relating to an airport, and bringing the flight activity to a complete halt. So those are the type of systemic risk, or knocking out the entire hospital grid of a certain city. So those are the type of systemic cyber risks that we're talking about here, which could be system-wide and can have a potentially unified and unequal impact on each organization depending on the activity that they are performing. So these were the 3 broader classifications that we came up with. And then, of course, the most important and perhaps the most relevant from today's discussion's perspective is the operational cyber risk. So we are going to stay focused on operational cyber risk aspect of this framework, and not going to do a deep dive into business cyber risk or systemic cyber risk. For those of you who are interested in learning more about it, just Google distribution analysis of information risk. Help yourself by downloading the paper and try and understand, what is it that we mean with regards to business cyber risk and systemic cyber risk. The paper provides an entire framework associated with that. Cyber 360 product that BBA has developed focuses purely on the operational cyber risk here. Right. So any questions so far? Great. Okay. So this leads us to the next stage. So here we are defining the cyber and the organizational, mapping it to the organizational-wide classification. So essentially, what we just discussed, operational, business, and systemic cyber risk models, the mapping of the cyber risk definitions are associated with that, which are really the loss of cyber and or physical property, loss of reputation. These are sort of examples, and perception of an institution's inability or franchise's inability to actually defend itself in case of a cyber event. And then finally, from a systemic risk perspective, the loss of cyber and or physical property due to a contagion or systemic event. So this is the kind of description that I shared with you earlier. Right. So doing a bit of a deep dive. So essentially, how we can develop an operational cyber risk preparedness using a what-if analysis. So here, what we are doing is we are providing a framework with regards to how we can generate a scenario. Again, a scenario generation is not a science; it's an art, as I mentioned earlier. It's an art which requires a group level thinking. Some of the consulting organizations, they call it, essentially a war room strategy. Where a big huddle can be undertaken by developing different sort of out of the box scenarios and using those as the baseline and developing an acceptance limit or acceptance framework to include those from the perspective of developing operational cyber risk. So in a nutshell, once a scenario is developed, what do we need to do? So once the scenario is developed, we need to actually parameterize that scenario. So we're going to talk a little bit about the parameterization of scenarios. So here we've given the steps. So once a scenario is refined, is developed, is accepted at the organizational level, we try and understand what is the potential frequency from a forward-looking perspective and what is the potential severity. Now here, one thing that needs to be kept in mind is that we need to be able to understand what is the acceptance limit from doing business perspective. So for example, if there's a minor breach, perhaps, let's say an unsuspecting employee actually clicked on a link in their email, which could potentially lead to a near miss. They received a birthday greeting and they thought there's a sort of link associated with sort of a gift coupon, and they clicked on it, which led to a malware. Of course, that could lead to a devastating impact within the organization. But if in all likelihood it's a near miss, or the loss threshold was really limited, let's say it is within the acceptance range of $10,000 from an organizational perspective. So we need to be able to actually understand that what is the acceptance limit before we actually parameterize those scenarios. So it could be construed as the cost of doing business, because thinking about these attacks and these scenarios, we are focusing on high severity but low frequency attacks here. So the cost of doing business can potentially be covered by insurance or insurance providers, or it could be really expensed from an organization's perspective. And the next step would be that creating that risk metric. What is the cost of not doing anything, which can lead to sort of wiping out the capital, or which can lead to reducing the earnings from a next year's perspective, which can lead to employees resigning or leaving the organization. So those type of metrics that need to be created. And the final piece is we integrate those within the key risk indicators, and then we get into the control framework side of things, that how we can enhance the controls to patch those vulnerabilities. So that's the sort of...
So I have to stop you there, because I think one of the key questions that I get as a director of an institution, and others I'm sure will ask, is how do you find a way to measure, what never happens? One of the things that as regulators will ask you, we want you to spend as much resources as you need to minimize the risk of something happening. So how do you rationalize spending the resources that you need to spend to convert a potential risk into a non-event? What sort of thinking do you go through from the context of your conversation here on this issue? Because I think that's really critical.
That's pretty critical. Yeah, exactly.
Be able to convince senior management to make that investment.
Absolutely. And that's really where we're getting with this conversation today, Andy, that we are basically, what we are doing is we are developing a scenario or a series of scenarios, a set of scenarios, which are going to actually give us a framework-based approach in terms of understanding the potential vulnerabilities which are on the horizon, i.e. forward-looking. Once we've undertaken that step, the next step is really for us to identify whether or not controls pre-exist to mitigate such a scenario. So we can trace back the creation of scenario framework that that you can see on the slide, to be able to actually identify whether or not those controls, how those controls get breached potentially, and do we have a control breach database that is going to tell us that this control actually was breached in the past and how that was compensated for. And if this control was not breached in the past, and there could be a confluence of events, a correlated event that can lead to the breach of this control, then what kind of control frameworks can be deployed? If we don't have such key control indicators or KCIs which are in place, then we need to be able to create those controls and undertake an investment, either investment from developing the policies, procedures perspective, or investment from a technological perspective, really to develop those controls and mitigate the risk, which is an outcome associated with this scenario. So that's really the sort of in a kind of at a high level, the kind of overall framework, and I'm going to actually exhibit that in a bit. So as I said earlier, and we are nearing the conclusion of top of the hour, so I'm going to wrap it up very quickly. So we have scenario design and analysis, scenario parameters. We talked about that. Again, acceptability threshold. The next two steps are very quantified steps, so I'm not going to go into the detail. Each scenario actually presents us with a frequency distribution as well as severity distribution. And then there is a range of distributions that the model provides from an output perspective, and we identify which is the best fit from a distribution, which is the best fit distribution. And using that best fit distribution, we will actually develop an overall simulated loss distribution, which is going to tell us that what would be the impact of this scenario in terms of in dollar terms. And what kind of budget or what kind of control framework that we need to develop to implement and to overcome that loss scenario. So here's a very interesting slide. As you can see that, this is really a 5x5 matrix, 6x6 matrix or 6x5 matrix, however you want to put it. But what we are trying to demonstrate here is that on the vertical axis, you can see the magnitude or the severity of the scenarios, where severity of cyber scenarios. There could be some scenarios which may have an outcome which is within the limit. There could be some scenarios which may have an outcome which is outside of the limit, right? And the challenge here is to really bring it to within the acceptable limit, So for the sake of today's conversation, we've developed three scenarios, right? And hypothetically speaking, scenario number 2 is within the acceptable range, which is the ranges are given at the bottom. And scenarios 1 and 3 are outside of the range. Challenge for us is really to bring these outputs, both from frequency and severity perspective, to an acceptable limit. And that sort of is what the overall, in a nutshell, distribution analysis of information risk does. It provides us with the outcomes, and then it allows us to develop a project for each scenario, which is going to actually bring us back within the acceptable limits of the organization. So that's the sort of application of controls, which are used as the basis to actually kind of identify that, we are able to mitigate those scenarios under the given or under a projected control framework. Does it make sense, Andy?
Yeah, this is more aligned with what a normal sort of risk heat map would look like, right? So
exactly.
I think managers and overseers and directors would understand that. The question I had on for example, on number 1, when you're moving number 1 from a loss event frequency of significance to something that's very low, how would you see? I mean, is that a function of the additional controls you're putting in place, or is that a function of getting out of that line of business, or both?
That's a very interesting question. So I think the first and foremost is really it's an outcomes-based or impact-based approach, right? So the severity would really help us determine that, whether or not what kind of action that we need to take. Should we exit the business line, or should we develop enhanced controls? And then we also want to look at our control repository, that what kind of existing controls are in place, and here we are talking about controls which are technological controls which are actually developed to manage human activity. So we can sort of segregate these controls both from technological and a non-technological perspective to identify that are they part of our current control repertoire. If not, then can we add more controls to them and be able to actually mitigate that vulnerability from kind of manifesting itself into an actual loss. So that's sort of the scenario number 1. Similarly for scenario number 3. So this type of conversation, this type of discussion would actually allow the chief information security officers to be able to develop a case where controls do not exist, such as, attack surface has increased as a result of an additional line of business that the organization has opted for. And for them to be able to mitigate that, they need to be able to identify new measures and controls. So that's the conversation that they need to have. Now, that being said, the key question then becomes that what is the cost of doing nothing? And that's really what the focus is in today's conversation. That if you do nothing, then we are really subjecting ourselves to a potential cyber attack, which can really have an impact, which is not acceptable within the risk appetite or risk threshold based on the heat map that we are presenting here. Right.
So what you're saying is doing that is not an option.
That's true. Yes. Yeah. So as a result of running these analysis scenarios, if you do nothing, then yeah, that's clearly a business case that CISO can take to the CFO and can be escalated to the board level, or can be presented for budget approval purposes. That these are the number of FTEs that we need. This is the technology that we need to sign up for, and this is the control that we need to develop from an operational risk perspective to be able to mitigate that risk. And that's the sort of business case that we have from an ROI perspective.
Well, it should be a no-brainer for most organizations to make these kinds of investments. But what do you say to people who are struggling with senior management and saying, prove to me that this is a worthwhile investment? How do you deal with that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I think that's a sort of the psychoanalysis. It's just a belief system. Of course, think about if this were to be done by a chief information security officer in the absence of such a framework, that would become even a more difficult sell. But with something like this, the conversation can really sort of be open to the rest of the members of the executive management, and they can use that as a baseline to have this conversation, right? It's graphic, it's visual, and it's also quantified. So this would allow them to really be able to kind of use that as the baseline and develop it from an organizational perspective. Develop the capabilities, i.e.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Great. So this brings us to the conclusion of today's conversation. So I'm just going to quickly wrap it up. But we talked about the impacts. We talked about mapping those impacts with the firm-wide taxonomy, and then we talked about identifying the sources and grouping them under those 4 different headers that we mentioned, which are really originate from the operational risk perspective. And the key benefits are, as we mentioned earlier, cost-benefit analysis, identifying that where should we get the insurance and how much of that should we get. Some cybercrimes are not even insurable. So those are some of the things that need to be brought into consideration. What is the premium that we need to pay from insurance perspective? So again, it's a quantifiable, measurable metric which can let everyone know that this is the sort of insurance premium that needs to be paid, or it can be developed internally by developing the control frameworks. And then finally, we have integration risk appetite, and it allows for an effective communication that I just mentioned, in the last slide. In conclusion, this can be used for an organizational unit or for the entire organization. It disseminates knowledge and helps us with the understanding of risk, including threat, vulnerability, and the impact analysis. And it has applications in different areas with regards to resource allocation and so forth. And finally, it enables comparison with different risk genres. So if you have let's say you can think of it like it's apples to apples when it comes to the market, credit, and other risks. So we use a common metric. And finally, it allows and supports management both at the enterprise and the BU level in making risk-aware decisions. Well, this brings us to the conclusion of today's presentation / webinar. And I want to thank you all for your presence. And if there are any questions, please feel free to send them Paula's way, and she can ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So if you guys have any questions, please put in the chat or feel free to unmute. Let me check if I have any questions here on my direct mail. Okay, I do not see anything here. Okay, great.
All right.
So thank you, Suhail.
Okay.
Thank you, Andy. This concludes our last webinar of the year. Thank you to our guests, and thank you for attending the webinar. We look forward to engaging with you in social media. If you have any further questions, if you like to discuss the solutions, you have our contact. It's on the display. Have a great evening, and I'm the BBAT. We wish you a very happy holiday season and a fresh 2021.
Perfect. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.